Welcome back to Football Weather. Galen Clavio, Matt Blaska joining you. Our weekly, as of now, maybe more frequently, dive into college football on the broad scale here on the Back Home Network. We're happy to be joining you folks once again. Matt, the temperature finally dropped, and this morning it actually felt like football weather. It was like 62 degrees outside, had that kind of air of mid-October. It's warmer now. This is actually perfect. It's about 76, 77 degrees right now, but you did just get that little taste of it. It's like, oh, this is nice. I forgot what this felt like.
I know. I think this morning you're just used to walking outside and the heat just hits you, but I'm actually wearing a sweatshirt today.
Wow.
I walked outside and when it's 100 degrees for 10, 15 straight days, and you walk outside and it's 60 or 70, it's freezing. So threw a sweatshirt on at Homefield. So made sure of it, and it's crazy how you feel at 60 degrees when it's like actually really nice out.
I mean, I did have the pleasure of being out on vacation. I was out in Orange County for about a week, and Orange County, not a hotbed of college football. I think we should note. I mean, I think that there's been one or two schools in Orange County that have had, at one point, what you would have considered one Division I, like FBS football, but not in a while. But, it's interesting because that feels like football weather, but not at the same time because of just the particular way the Pacific Ocean feels. I'm sure if you're from California, that's how it feels. But in terms of what Midwesterners or even people from the South would think about football weather, not quite it, but it was cool. And I did like that. That was nice. And it's nice to have a little bit of that I've kind of brought with me here. Certainly, when I was out for the Big Ten football media days in Vegas, that was not football weather. That was weather of a different order entirely.
That was sit on top of the sun weather, and hopefully you don't burn. We're now, but as our podcast is called here, we're ready for football weather.
Yes, I was worried, so I did a quick Google search. Are there any FBS schools in Orange County? There are not.
Okay.
It does not look like there's even any FCS schools in Orange County, which makes me think, is that the largest county by population in the U.S. that doesn't have a Division I football program?
It has to be, right? I mean, there can't. I don't know that I can't think of any East Coast. I can't think of any.
We might need to actually, maybe this should be our new, I would dig this. Maybe our goal should be to bring a Division I football program to one of the schools in Orange County.
Let's do it.
I think UC Irvine is right there. That feels like a perfect fit. Let's maybe work on this, you and me, and we can see where it takes us.
I agree. Let's get some anteaters going it's a great college football name. I can't imagine how much fun that would be.
Let's go ahead and dive in and talk about Homefield Apparel, our presenting sponsor on the Back Home Network, who I'm sure would love an additional school like UC Irvine to sell apparel on. We're both wearing, you've got that. I love that Indiana State hoodie.
Let's love it.
I've struggled. I've wanted to buy that hoodie, but you already own it. And I don't want, like, twinning on Indiana State would be weird, I think. Yeah.
I'm not even sure how this has to be like 6 or 7 years old now, and I still wear it I love this sweatshirt. I love the color of the sweatshirt, the logo.
Great. Yeah. It's great. There's something, I was thinking about this last night. I'm sitting there watching that very dull Hall of Fame game between San Diego and Detroit. And I was thinking, is Detroit slept on for maybe having the best uniforms in the NFL? Because they're not just a classic look, but unlike the Colts, who frankly, despite being a Colts fan, I think the Colts uniforms are like dreadfully dull.
Yeah.
The Lions, that Honolulu blue that they use, that lighter shade of blue, is just, it's so distinct and it looks so good. And I think the same about Indiana State. Indiana State, I feel like, undersold the appeal of their color combination for many years. And yet, when you see it in that hoodie or the other things that you can get on Homefield Apparel from Indiana State, it looks great. It really does. And it's something about light blue or powder blue, not Carolina blue, because I actually feel Carolina blue almost goes too light.
Right.
But that particular approach that Indiana State has been great. I am wearing not a football shirt, but I've got the Minnesota National Champs in Hockey from '79 shirt that came out several years ago. But any of these pieces of apparel or anything well beyond that, you can find at Homefield Apparel. Go to the website, homefieldapparel.com. Use the code HOME23. HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. And they got some great stuff coming up here. They just finished some of their summer series. They've got a bunch of new things coming up. And if you're interested in following along with this, follow along with Homefield Apparel on social media. They have a great X account. They have a great Instagram account. You'll be able to find what's going on. You can get signed up for their mailing lists and whatnot. And it's the thing to do if you want to get great apparel and keep abreast of what's coming. So homefieldapparel.com, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. All right, Matt.
Yep.
Normally we've been, for the last few episodes as we started this podcast off, we've been talking about all the crazy political stuff and intra-conference fighting and things like that. There really wasn't any of that this last week. I mean, it was a pretty quiet week. The most galling thing was Gannett deciding to pick up a nationwide column written about how bad IU's non-conference schedule is, as if we haven't got enough of that, from a guy who was a Tennessee writer for many years. It's like, oh, that's an unbiased source. but beyond that, there really hasn't been a lot of easily decipherable news. It's just we're kind of in a holding pattern right now, and it's good because fall camps just started for most of these teams.
It's nice talking season, as everyone calls July, talking season, the dead time, and we have now hit the in camp, ready to roll. We're starting to get reports about who's looking good. Obviously, you don't want to hear injuries, but you hear about injury reports. And now we've hit August, and we're about to turn the page. We're 3 weeks from week 0 starting here with some actual football games happening. So it's exciting that we're going to transition. We'll still talk about the business like we've said, but there's just really nothing going on right now. But it's nice to actually talk about real football that's going to be happening here on the field.
So we were thinking about how do we best approach this? I mean, there's no way even the big pods that are nationwide, it's very hard to really do legitimate service deep dive wise to all the conferences and all the teams. And I think that's beyond our capacity here, just as it is among even the podcasts that think it's within their capacity. But what I did want to do to start with was let's focus on the thing that is really dominating the landscape of college football right now, which is the playoff.
Yep.
And let's talk about, since we know we're going to have 12 teams in the playoff this year, and we know that it's a different format in that they're not reserving the top 4 spots for the top 4 conference champions. Let's start going through conference by conference as we get started with August, and let's talk about what teams actually have a legitimate shot to make the playoff based upon what we think will happen with the season. Now, we'll be able to modify that a bit by the rankings, which should come out, we think, within the week. Maybe by the end of this next week, we should have our first set of rankings from the AP, which will give us a little bit of a sense of what the national consensus is. But we've already got a fairly good idea between the power rankings. I mean, you've had S&P Plus come out with power rankings. You've had a lot of journalists and rating systems come out. But we've kind of got an idea of who the best teams are and more or less what the hierarchies of the conferences are. So then it's really about what are the actual games that they're playing. So we thought we'd start that process by focusing first on the SEC, because at the end of the day, the perception is the SEC is going to have a bunch of playoff contending teams. Is that actually the case? Not just on paper, which the SEC loves, as we know, but in terms of how their schedules line up with each other and what that will leave each team with as we get to the end of the season. Yeah,
and I mean, it's a great spot to start with the SEC, as they are. I'm just we're looking at some analytics over here over the last couple of days, and just most of them have the highest projection of teams between 4 and 5 teams making the pool, which is our field, which is probably a legitimate. Last year they had the 13th, 14th, 15th ranked team, so they were in that mix all year. They have probably the most depth in terms of their top part of their conference. Maybe the bottom isn't as strong, but certainly there's going to be some contenders, and there's going to be a chance for those teams that are in the middle. Let's say the teams maybe 4 through 8 or 4 through 9, if you're going that deep, to try to get to 5 and 3 in conference. And that, as we know, the SEC, they like to count that 8-game schedule. So that's where you really need to hit that mark, is that 5 and 3 mark. So how many schools does that actually include in the SEC this year?
Yeah. And it's really fascinating because there's a couple of things about the SEC and looking at it from a 10,000-foot view that both contribute to and also argue against the narrative about the SEC. In that, as you come into the season, the number one team in the country for most of the polls that I've seen has been Texas. Mm-hmm. And this idea that, Texas they were in the playoff last year. They played well. Yes, they're replacing a bunch of players that went to the NFL, plus their quarterback who did not. But they're bringing an even higher echelon of talent, hypothetically, into the mix. And they have a schedule that is going to test them, but they've got a lot of cushion in terms of being able to sustain a loss or two and still make it in. But then you've got a bunch of other teams that people think might be good, but there's not a lot of consensus about some of the other teams. Now, as I went through this, it's like there's one team to me as I went through it where it's like, wow, actually the schedule breaks really well for this team and they could go undefeated on the season. And then there's other teams where they've been talked about in very lofty terms, and I don't know that the schedule actually contributes to them getting to the level they would need to be competitive at that level.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is notable is that the depth of the SEC might end up doing again this year what it did last year, where is it depth or is it a lack of separation? Because I know I had a huge number of teams that were clustered in the 8-4, 7-5, 6-6 range when I projected everything out, to the point that it dragged several teams that could have been 9-3 or better down into that level, because other teams might not be good enough to do that themselves, but might be good enough to win a home game against a team that isn't quite in the very top echelon of SEC teams.
So we sent both of our projections to each other, so we'll get into here in a second. But one team that I think maybe that's not going to make the playoff, but has a very interesting schedule is Oklahoma, right?
Right.
They have this schedule. They play Auburn at home. They have South Carolina on the road, Texas in Dallas. They go to Alabama, Missouri, and LSU at home. So they have this schedule that is certainly really difficult, but they're going to have an opportunity to play potentially an upset that's going to knock one of the top teams down, which we saw last year with Oklahoma when they knocked off Alabama at home late in the season. So you're going to have those opportunities with them and some other schools that, again, not projected to be in the actual field, but if the strength of the SEC is actually that strong, you may see these upsets that you may not see just because of that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think Missouri you could throw into that category, where Missouri's got a relatively favorable schedule, and they've got a couple of games. One of them is actually against Oklahoma on the road. The other one against Texas A&M at home. Well, I mean, if they beat Texas A&M and they beat Oklahoma, or they beat Auburn on the road, well, now you're talking about a completely different type of season.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't feel like right now there's a huge amount to distinguish between these teams, and a lot of it becomes – Oklahoma's a great example. We know there's a lot of pressure on Brent Venables. Auburn, a lot of pressure on Hugh Freeze.
Yeah.
Florida, a lot of pressure on Billy Napier. I mean, Ari Wasserman had him as the coach on the hot seat, the hottest hot seat going into the season, which, whether that's true or not, you look at Florida's schedule and you say, well, gosh, not only do they have to play Georgia, they have to play at Ole Miss, they have to play Texas at home, they have to play at Texas A&M, but they also have to play at Miami, and they got to play Florida State, and both of those teams are going to be hard ones to tackle. And I haven't even mentioned that they have to play at LSU. Florida could be good and be 7-5.
Right.
And there's a lot of teams like that where it's really hard to figure out what the fulcrum point is for these team seasons. And whether, like, Auburn's a great example. You could legitimately see Auburn lose 5 games in a row in the middle of the season. So does Hugh Freeze get fired in the middle of that if they lose 5 in a row?
He'll play playing golf. He's fine.
Right. Yeah. But there's a lot of things like that. And you add in, we don't have a great sense of the quarterback quality at a lot of these schools.
Yeah.
And even the ones we do, like Florida is a good example of a team. Is that going to be enough?
He's hurt already.
Right. So that's where I think it's just it's an interesting conference. It always is, but it's not necessarily a conference that has the dominant group of teams that will win enough games to project themselves forward. And you just can't keep going back to the argument of, well, everybody is equally tough in the conference, because if that's the case, then you like, it's a disingenuous argument. Like you basically can't look at that and take anything that they say in good faith at that stage.
Yeah, and I was curious too. Florida is the one team that does play all these really. That's probably the most difficult schedule, if not really one or two. Are they a school that could go 8-4, lose the Miami game, and be in the conversation just based on their schedule? Right, they might be the one team that bucks that trend, which would drive people crazy. Right.
Right. Well, and so I think what we should do. Let's talk about the teams we feel good about in terms of getting into the college football playoff. Like, if we assume, and I think it's a good assumption, the SEC is likely to get 4 teams, or at least 3 teams.
3 teams for sure, yeah.
For sure. If we concentrated on that, what are you looking at and why? So let me start with you.
Yeah.
And just kind of talk through, like, who do you have in the SEC title game, given the way that is settled in terms of the overall records and the records in conference and whatnot?
Yeah, so it's not a cop out, but I do think Texas is going to be really, really good. Arch Manning, you just have to assume he's ready to go by how he played last year, and their schedule breaks really, really nice. I mean, I know they play Ohio State on the road to start the season. That's a completely different Ohio State team that won the national championship last year. So assuming it's also a game you can lose and not really have it affect you. Right. It doesn't matter as much, but generally, I know they go to Florida, they play Oklahoma and Dallas, but then they have Kentucky, Mississippi State, Vandy in 3 straight games after that, and then they finish Georgia, Arkansas, A&M. So really, they play the lower tier. And this was their problem last year. If you remember, the conversation was if they lost a second game, they may be in trouble not making the field. This year, I think they're better. Their talent's a lot deeper. I project them to go 8-0 and actually go 12-0 in the conference. That was my projection, to beat Georgia at Georgia for the first time, losing a home game in 5 years. And then I have them playing Georgia in that game. That's Georgia's only loss. It's not I have some affiliation with Georgia, but I think they're going to be really, really good. I think Gunnar Stockton's going to be really good. That defense is always a top 10 defense. Now it's the offense, right? The one thing I did read up about was their offense. While they were not as good last year, they're a team that's always third and manageable. And when you are doing that with the defense they have, they're going to be really, really good, or they're going to keep games close, or they're going to make sure that they're not going to lose a tight game. And that's happened over the last 5 years. Kirby's lost 19 games since he's been there, which is a remarkable
19 games in how many years now?
9, 10. Yeah. He's been there almost a decade now. And so you just have to trust Georgia until Georgia tells you no. And I know it was really hard for me to project Texas beating them in Athens, but I think that is going to be a good game. I think they're both coming off a bye. No, sorry, Georgia's not. Texas is coming off a bye. So I think that's really important for Texas there. So those are my top 2 teams. Yeah.
And I have the same top 2. I just have them flipped. I have Georgia going 12-0 because they're Georgia. It's hilarious hearing all of this non-conference schedule stuff, and then you look at Georgia's non-conference schedule, and it's Marshall, Austin Peay, Charlotte, and Georgia Tech.
And Tech on a neutral field where it's supposed to be a Tech this year. So
right, exactly. And you look at their SEC schedule, I think it falls perfectly for Georgia. Yes, the game at home versus Texas is tough, but I need to see Texas actually win that game before I'd be willing to give it to them. They play at Tennessee, which initially I was like, that could be a game that they could lose. But given the uncertainty at quarterback for Tennessee and the fact that that's an early season game, I like Georgia in that. And then you run down the list. They get Alabama at home. They get Ole Miss at home. They get Florida at home. Those all add up to me to a 12-0 season in the regular season for Georgia. And I agree with you about Texas. I actually have them going 11-1 and 7-1. I think they'll beat Ohio State coming out of the gate, which will be a mild surprise. But as you said, it's a different Ohio State team and a Texas team that feels like it's ready to take a step up. And the rest of Texas's schedule, while I would say in places perhaps, I don't know. No, actually, I won't say. It's probably less challenging overall than Georgia's because, again, you're playing Florida relatively early. Your rest of your road games are at Kentucky and at Mississippi State, and Oklahoma, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, and Texas A&M, not exactly a murderer's row of teams you have to face in your home stadium. So I think those 2 feel like pretty safe bets.
Yeah.
If there were going to be 2 teams that were going to knock on the door of the SEC title game, it feels like it'd be Alabama and LSU. So what do you have with those two teams?
So I had Alabama going 10-2 and LSU going 9-3. And so I did this because I thought about Oklahoma last year, and that was my last game of the year. Oklahoma's gonna be playing for probably not obviously the playoff, but playing for something. Brent Venables probably be on the hot, maybe already been fired at that point. But I said maybe this is the game where LSU gets tripped up, as we've seen. Brian Kelly has had these moments, especially at LSU, to finish off seasons or struggle, and I had them finishing 9-3 to finish the season, which puts them 6-2 in the conference. And then I had, you say Bama, right? I had Bama at 10-2. I actually had A&M at 7-1 in the conference as well.
We're going to come back to A&M in a second because I think that's a really divisive team and one that I've seen all kinds of projections on. But no, I agree with you on LSU. A lot of people, LSU's always got an insane amount of talent, but they've tended to stumble in games where they shouldn't. You look at the schedule this year, they got to start at Clemson, and Clemson might be legitimately a top 3 team in the country this year. That's a really, but again, much like Texas's game at Ohio State, a game you can lose without it really coming back on you negatively, I think, if you're LSU. And then you look at the rest of the schedule, and Florida feels like a game they're going to win. At Ole Miss, it feels like a game they're going to win because Ole Miss is breaking in a new quarterback. And Ole Miss having to win with defense doesn't feel like a natural state of being for them. South Carolina could be challenging, but you get them in Baton Rouge. And you get Texas A&M in Baton Rouge, and you got to go to Alabama. And I do have them losing that game at Alabama, but I've got them overall going 10-2 and 7-1 in conference because I feel like they're going to be equipped to beat Oklahoma on the road. I just have a hard time seeing Oklahoma at the end of a very long season being able to keep it together enough, having played a really, really tough run in. And we'll talk about that when we get to talking about them later on. Just feels like maybe too much for them to sustain at the end. And I just kind of feel like LSU's schedule is favorable enough that it would contribute to being able to go 7-1 in conference this year.
And the one thing, I know I project them 9-3, but the one thing with LSU is they come off buys for these 3 games. Clemson, which is obviously a bye, it's the first game of the year. They go into South Carolina coming off a bye, and Alabama coming off a bye, which is really, really good for them, right? Probably their 3 biggest games of the year, or 3 toughest games of the year, in theory, are all coming off of a rest. So I think that's going to help them, and certainly in that mix when we're getting down to the end of the season, and that's why I'm like, man, maybe the Oklahoma game is could trip them up because we're at that end of that rope. They've already played these tough games. I know it's coming off of Western Kentucky, so it's a whatever, but still they have this difficult road all season long, and their schedule strength is going to help them. If they happen to beat Clemson, they're going to be in really good shape, right? They're going to be in really, really good shape for that out of conference win. They're going to probably get an extra mulligan if they were the 9-3 team, if that team's on the edge there. So that's where I think LSU's in a really good spot if they can win that first game. They're in a better spot, or they're in a better spot there, but they're still in a good spot if they lose that game. They have to just go 6-2 in conference.
Alabama is an interesting one as well. Not a terribly challenging non-conference schedule. We'll see if the Castellano stuff with Boston College is that's some bold stuff there.
Yeah.
But Louisiana Monroe, Wisconsin, and Eastern Illinois all at home, especially this year, doesn't feel like it's going to be particularly challenging. I've got them going 6-2 in conference, losing at Georgia and losing at South Carolina, because I do think South Carolina is going to get a scalp this year, and Alabama's as good of a choice as any. But it is going to be really fascinating, I think, overall, in terms of thinking about this Alabama team. There's some pressure on them. Their defense is probably going to be better. We're not totally sure what happens with them offensively. They're still stocked with an insane amount of talent. They're going to be right there. A 6-2 Alabama team's probably making the playoff regardless. And since that's kind of the context we're talking about things in, even if you were to flip and say Alabama beats South Carolina on the road but loses at home to LSU, it doesn't fundamentally, in my mind at least, change what I would conceive of being the top 4.
Yeah.
I don't know. Any thoughts on Alabama in general?
it's a similar conversation I just had with LSU. They have Georgia after a bye, LSU after a bye. I'm not saying they're going to win both those games. That certainly helps them. But their big game. But that South Carolina game, I actually pegged them for a loss there too. It's the 5th game after playing at Georgia, home against Vandy, at Missouri, home against Tennessee. That's a South Carolina. That's a maybe one of the toughest stretches of the season you're going to see from anybody in the sport. And they may just be out of gas.
Right.
Or South Carolina could be very good. South Carolina has a really difficult schedule too. But I think that 6-2 mark, like you said, is going to be the mark for any SEC team. If they're 6-2, they're getting in as long as they don't lose to Louisiana Monroe or Wisconsin or something like that. They're going to be fine. I never thought that Jalen Milroe was the right quarterback for DeBoer. It just never seemed like it matched up. Now he's got that. Now he's got his own guys in there, and he should be able to run his offense a little better. So yeah, I had them going 10-2, 6-2 in conference, and they seem probably a shoo-in to go to the playoff.
Now let's dive into Texas A&M, who I had at 8-4, and you had at what?
10-2.
10-2. So we definitely need to dive into this. So my rationale on the 8-4 for A&M was, again, I look at this team and they've got talent, but both like historically and even last year, they just feel like they lack that top gear that you need to compete at the level where you would be a legitimate playoff contender. And when I look at their schedule, it just has a lot of landmines on it. I mean, they're non-conference, UT, San Antonio, Utah State, Samford. Well, those are easy, but they got to go to Notre Dame the 3rd week of the season. And Notre Dame stands to bear, I think, is going to be a pretty good team this year, as they have been over the course of the last several years. They have some layups in SEC play, but they got to play Florida at home, which I think is a tough one given, if Florida's got good quarterback play at that point, we'll see what happens. They got to go to LSU. They've got to go to Texas, and then you get add in, they got to go to Missouri. They've got South Carolina at home. Like, they've got a lot of frisky teams that are right there in the midst. Even if they just lost Notre Dame, LSU, and Texas, now you're looking at a 9-3 team. It leaves them no margin for error. Yeah. And I'm having a hard time in my head. And a lot of this, I guess, depends on how much you want to believe in Brian Kelly. Do you buy the idea that they can go in and win at LSU? Do you buy the idea they can go into South Bend and beat Notre Dame? I just don't at this point. And so that's where I got my record from. So 5-3 in conference and 8-4 overall.
Yeah. I gave them Notre Dame. I don't know. I just feel A&M's turned the corner. I really like Elko. I mean, A&M has been this team for 100 years now. They've just been shooting themselves in the foot. But they were so close. They played really well down the stretch last year. I know they lost to Texas at the end, but they ended up finishing 6-2 in the conference. But they were 8-4 overall because it was a slow start. To me, like, that middle part is really gonna determine their season. That middle 5 when you play Auburn at home, Mississippi, they have those 3 in a row at home. But then you go to Arkansas, which is never a layup, and then you go to LSU. And then you're right. That LSU game for me, I had them beating LSU. To me, I switched that back and forth a couple of times. So you can really interchange that, right? If they go in LSU and win, then they're probably going to look at still probably 9-3 or 10-2, right? Going into, or a 10-1 going to the Texas game potentially. So you might see a scenario where both them and Texas are 7-0 going playing for the playoff. I really like that team. I think they're going to be good, and I think Elko is the right guy for that job.
Yeah, it's going to be really fascinating to see what the setup happens there. And that's one of those teams that feels like a swing team. The other teams in that range for me, and I guess this is maybe we can also get into your next echelon.
Yep.
Kind of feels right now, and tell me if I'm wrong. So basically every team that's above, below the playoff spots for me, but above 6-6. This is another group of essentially 5 teams. And so I've got A&M in this mix. I've got South Carolina in this mix. I've got Ole Miss in this mix. I've got Tennessee in the mix. And I've got Florida. Florida tailing. They're 7-5 in my projections. But so maybe let's set Florida aside because we've already talked about them a little bit. Ole Miss is one of those teams that was on the doorstep of maybe getting through and lost a couple of games they shouldn't have lost last year. And their non-conference is Not particularly challenging, I would say. Georgia State, Tulane, Washington State, and the Citadel. And then you've got their conference schedule, and I think on paper, it's a pretty favorable schedule, all things considered. You've got Arkansas at home, you've got LSU at home, you're at Georgia, you're at Oklahoma, South Carolina at home, Florida at home, Mississippi State at home, and at Kentucky. So it's a schedule where it feels like if they can pull off either the win at home versus LSU or the win on the road at Oklahoma, suddenly they're right in the midst of the playoff conversation. But it also feels like Ole Miss just specializes in like tripping itself up at the worst possible times.
Yep.
And that's why I couldn't put them higher than 5-3 in conference and 9-3 overall.
Yeah. So if you project them to win those 7 not easy, but the Georgia State, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tulane, Washington State, the Citadel, Mississippi State, that's 7. They got to find 2 wins to get to 9. And they play LSU at home. They play South Carolina at home. They have Florida at home. So 3 of those games are in Oxford, even though they lost to Kentucky last year, which is still the most puzzling game probably of the season last year, losing to Kentucky, a 0-win Kentucky team in the conference last year at home. So you're right. They have to figure out how to flip 2 of those. Can they flip those 2? Because they're not going to Athens and winning in Georgia. I doubt it. I saw that game 2 years ago. They lost by 40. I know it's a different team, but whatever. Lane has never done well in Athens. So if you take that one out of there, you got to find 2 of the other 4. Can they win 2 of those home games essentially to get them to 9 wins? With that said, with that schedule, 9-3, they're on the lower tier of 9-3. They may need to be the big the SEC team to go 10-2 to actually get in. They may need the 10th win.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be an issue with them that's just going to be fascinating to think about, because they've historically last few seasons, I think, have had the quality where they could have punched through and just haven't been able to up to this point. And again, I think to some degree, the fulcrum for them is they can't lose any dumb games, and they really do have to beat probably one of LSU or Oklahoma or Florida. They really have to beat actually 2 of the 3, LSU, Oklahoma, and Florida.
Right.
And it feels like to some degree, I guess maybe you could throw South Carolina into the mix as well if you want to do 3 out of those 4. Can they do that? Yeah. Know. So let's talk about South Carolina while we're at it. So a team that became a cause celeb for a lot of people to make the playoff last year, didn't work out. They've got obviously the game that they have to play every year against Clemson. They've got Virginia Tech at home in the non-conference as the first game of the year. Is that a home game or is that a neutral site game? Now, actually, I'm looking at 2 different sources here.
Good question. It's in Atlanta, isn't it? I think it's in Atlanta.
It may be in Atlanta. So it's a neutral site game. Yeah. Just wanted to make sure for accuracy purposes for the podcast, folks. But it feels like South Carolina, despite having some favorable things on the schedule, like they get Alabama at home, they get Oklahoma at home, but they got to go to Missouri, LSU, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M. Mm-hmm. They could lose all 4 of those games, and even if they only lose 3 of the games, that still puts them essentially way behind the 8 ball, because it seems unlikely they're going to beat Clemson in a non-conference showdown, given how strong Clemson is this year. So much as we saw with a couple of other teams, they don't really have that margin of error that they need once the season comes down to that.
Right. And like you said, schedule-wise, it's brutal. They have the 2 really difficult out-of-conference games. Clemson, like I think we said earlier, probably a top 5, or not, definitely a top 10, probably a top 5 team. And then you also play Virginia Tech, which, again, is a neutral site game. Virginia Tech's not been as good, but they're still relatively probably in the upper tier of the ACC. And they also play Coastal Carolina, which has not been a pushover at all in the last 5 years. So their schedule lines up to be the most difficult. And if they can somehow get to 9-3, they're going to get in just basically because they're going to have enough wins somewhere. I had them losing at LSU, at Ole Miss, and at Texas A&M. I had those three losses. They're all on the road. Those are difficult places to play.
Yep.
And they could go. There's a very good chance they could go into LSU undefeated, but then they're playing a game at LSU in Death Valley, probably a night game. which is almost an impossible task to win that game for sure. So 9-3 is, if they get, like I said, they get 9-3, they're going to get in just because they're going to have the wins. But can they get 9 wins? That's the question. I mean, they have the most athletic quarterback, Lenora Sellers. He took less money to stay, so they know the system. He's going to be really important for them to stay healthy. If he stays healthy, they obviously have a really good chance. And he's one of the few guys returning in the entire nation besides Arch and DJ Lagway that actually are impactful quarterbacks from a year ago that are still in the same roster, right? So those are really that's an important factor that may help them in this conference early on to get going.
Yeah. Tennessee, this is a tough one to figure out. The quarterback upheaval and the fact that they have such talent on the roster. And they have what I think is a pretty good coach. But they've also got a schedule where they got to play Georgia, they got to play at Alabama, they got to play at Florida, and then they've still got the rest of the schedule. And Oklahoma at home is not going to be a pushover. Like, there's just a lot of little potential landmines, as we saw last year with them losing at Arkansas, where it was like no one really anticipated that, and then boom. And their non-conference is, again, a cakewalk. It's Syracuse, East Tennessee State, Alabama, Birmingham, and New Mexico State, all at home. That's their non-conference games. And I like the rest of their talent enough to think, well, they could probably go 9-3 overall, but I have a hard time seeing them get above 9-3. That really feels like a ceiling, given the fact that we don't really have a sense of what they're going to be getting offensively.
Yeah, I mean, I know they flip quarterbacks with UCLA, right? So basically, the first trade in history of college football.
I mean, if you want to look for stalwart offensive programs, pattern yourself out from last year, UCLA is really what you want to be going after,
right? So, and I was surprised to see them as high in the S&P Plus. They were 13th overall and projected to win 8.8 games. So again, they have the talent. Like their defense is going to be just as good as it was last year. It's now figuring to see if that offense can get going with a quarterback that's been there for 3 months, Joey Aguilar. So you're right. They'll start off 2-0, but then they got Georgia. Then they're at Alabama, and they play Florida in November. That's it. Okay. They've always played Florida third week in September. That's an interesting one. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's gonna be difficult. Like those are 3 difficult games. And that's not including other games, like playing Arkansas, and who's always been a problem for them, or even Oklahoma, who's going to be a problem all year with their good defense. So certainly they have to figure out how to get to 9 wins, and they're in a place where they have to get to 9, or everybody says that's surprised to get 9 wins, but they might need to get to 10 just based on some of these scheduling quirks that may come up for them. So they're a wild card to me just based on just the quarterback and just really not knowing what their offense is. Their offense struggled last year. They were not a good offensive team. They were just really good defensively, and they beat teams defensively all season long. So they have to improve offensively to have a chance this year.
Let's hit Florida real quick before we wrap this up. And we talked about them a little bit before. You did mention DJ Lagway injured, but the report that came out, I think just this morning, was it's not expected to be something that lingers into the regular season. He's walking around in a boot with a calf injury. Obviously had some injury issues last year. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of pressure on this Florida team, and this is where this might be the program that's the most cursed by past success right now in the SEC, because I think this is what happens when you have 2 generational coaches within 15 years of each other in obviously Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer. They achieved at levels that Florida had never really achieved at before they got there in terms of Spurrier, or hadn't since Spurrier left in the case of Meyer. But it's not really the normal state of being historically for Florida, who we've come to think in this last generation as being a team that competes for national titles. But that's not really how they've been historically. And so they are kind of in this cycle, the same cycle Tennessee often finds themselves in, where they're fighting perceptions that aren't reality, but you still got to deal with the perceptions as the head coach. And they have a lot of challenges in front of them because they're overscheduled, as we mentioned earlier, with those games out of conference against Miami and Florida State. And they've got to go to LSU, A&M, and Ole Miss. They've got Texas at home. They've got Georgia and in the cocktail party, and they've got Tennessee. And even though I think the talent is good enough that they'll be able to get bowl eligibility and a bit better than that, they could go 3-5 in the SEC, and I wouldn't be at all shocked.
Yeah. So from September 13th to November 1st, there's 2 buys in there. They go at LSU, at Miami, home against Texas, at A&M, Mississippi State at home, Georgia cocktail party. I know I said there was a tougher stretch earlier. That's a very really that could be 0-5.
Yeah,
that could be 1-5. Sorry, Mississippi State. That could be 1-5. That's tough, right? So you got to find some wins. You're right though. The ceiling could be 9-3. Could they be the 1-8-4 team that has a look into the playoff? If everything breaks correctly for them, I don't know if that's even possible in a 12-team playoff. But they're going to struggle. It's just such a tough schedule. Like no one with that schedule is going to be able to really make a serious push for the playoff.
Yeah. So all that said, and we're kind of at the point where we're going to wrap up anyway. A lot of it is obviously going to be dependent on what happens in other conferences. But it does feel, as you'll see, I think in the Big Ten, the teams that make the title game of this conference are going to get into the playoff. And then it just becomes a matter of who's best positioned after that to outmaneuver other teams that are competing. And I mean, I would not be at all shocked if you had a situation like I've got here where you've got Georgia at 12-0, Texas at 11-1, LSU at 10-2, and Alabama at 10-2. For all 4 of those teams to be in the playoff, It would be an easy narrative. I think it gets a little harder if one of those teams has 3 losses, as we saw last year. But if you look at, for instance, the one thing about the SEC I'm really fascinated about more than anything else, let's take LSU and Ole Miss. If you flop that game where LSU loses at Ole Miss, and now Ole Miss is suddenly 10-2, maybe in that 4th playoff spot, but LSU is going in and their losses are at Clemson, at Ole Miss, and at Alabama, and they've got wins over Texas A&M and at Oklahoma and Florida. Is that going to be enough to get them into the playoff? I think there's going to be at least an argument there. I don't know that there should be, but I think that there will be.
This is where Tony Buttigieg stands up and says, this is why we need the AQs, because we need the 3 to play the 6 and the 4 to play the 5. And you have this playoff before the playoff even starts, because you're going to get in a situation, as we both projected differently. But it seems like the middle here could be really strong. And if one of those 2 teams can flip a win, maybe somehow go to Georgia and knock Georgia off, or Texas, then you're talking about a completely different conversation for those teams that are 4, 5, and 6, or 5, 6, and 7. Because it does feel like they're going to get at least 4. I can't imagine they're going to get 3 again. It does feel like they're probably going to be back in that 4 range. And 5 seems high, but it's certainly doable, just based on just how things might break for them this year. And they have some of these, like Texas and A&M, they have those out-of-conference games, and same with LSU, that could put them over the top.
Yeah,
yeah.
And ultimately, it really comes down to this idea of double-digit wins, if you're in the SEC, are probably going to get you into the playoff.
Yep.
It's just, is there enough separation amongst enough teams to be able to get the double-digit wins, especially since, for all the talk about how you want to have a tough non-conference schedule, you've got some teams here who basically left themselves 0 margin for error because of those schedules. And that's going to be interesting to watch the committee deal with.
Right. Right. And certainly some of these teams are probably happy they schedule those games, because it does maybe give them an extra boost. But you're right. LSU loses that game, they're down to basically having to go 7-1. But if it's a close game, who knows, right? But it's going to be difficult for them to navigate their way to a 10-2 finish if they lose that Clemson game. Same thing for Texas. It makes it a little more challenging.
We'll have more of this type of podcasting coming up as we move forward, as we're going to be tackling the Big Ten. Obviously, we'll tackle the ACC and the Big 12, although maybe with a little less breadth, since those conferences are not as deep as the SEC and the Big Ten are. But a lot more to talk about with college football as we get ready for the opening kickoff of the season, just about 3 weeks away, which is exciting news. Matt, as always, a pleasure. Great seeing you, and we'll look forward to talking to you again next time.
Can't wait. Enjoy your week. And
thanks to all you folks for joining us here on Football Weather. We'll catch you on the flip side. So long, everybody.